Today, we're diving into a fascinating and honestly kind of unbelievable paradox. We're looking at a man who became famous for doing, well, almost entirely nothing, and yet he somehow became one of the most overwhelmingly popular presidents in American history. Yep, we're talking about Calvin Coolidge. So, how on earth does a leader build a massive political brand entirely around silence and inactivity? How does doing nothing become exactly what an entire nation wants? Well, let's unpack the mystery of Silent Cal.
To really understand this paradox, we have to start with one of the most dramatic ascensions in history. Section 1. A kerosene lamp presidency. Restoring dignity in the dead of night. Just imagine this scene. It's August 3rd, 1923, around 2:30 in the morning. Coolidge is visiting his family in the quiet, rustic town of Plymouth, Vermont. Suddenly, word arrives that President Warren G. Harding has died. In that exact instant, Coolidge becomes the President of the United States. But, there are no grand ballrooms here, no chief justices, no massive crowds. Instead, he's sworn in by the flickering light of a simple kerosene lamp. And the person administering the oath? Actually, it's his own father, who just happened to be a notary public. Coolidge places his hand on the family Bible, and just like that, the torch of leadership is passed in the middle of the night. And the political climate at the time made this rustic, humble image incredibly powerful. Even his political rivals saw it. Alfred E. Smith, a Democratic admirer, noted that Coolidge was distinguished more for his character than for any heroic achievement. Smith wrote, "His great task was to restore the dignity and prestige of the presidency when it had reached the lowest ebb in our history, in a time of extravagance and waste." After a period totally marked by scandal and extravagance, here was a guy who just embodied simple, old-fashioned moral precepts. Now, before that fateful night, Coolidge didn't just burst out of nowhere. He built his career methodically. He was born on the 4th of July, 1872, to a village storekeeper in Vermont. He goes to Amherst College, graduates with honors, and then slowly, step by step, climbs the political ladder in Northampton, Massachusetts, going from a simple councilman to a lawyer, and eventually, by 1919, he becomes the Republican governor of Massachusetts. So on his way to the highest office in the land, he developed a thoroughly, unshakably conservative philosophy. He definitely wasn't a flashy man. He was a steady one. Which brings us to Section 2, the art of doing nothing. Coolidge prosperity. So how exactly does a deeply conservative, methodical man lead a country that is suddenly accelerating into the roaring, booming 1920s? Well, the answer is he stays completely out of the way. By 1924, riding this massive wave of material wealth that quickly became known as Coolidge prosperity, he runs for election in his own right. In his inaugural address, he boldly stated that the country had achieved a state of contentment seldom before seen. And by running on a super simple pledge to just maintain the status quo, he won a staggering 54% of the popular vote. So how did he actually govern to achieve this? His policy playbook was remarkably strict. His very first message to Congress called for isolation in foreign policy, sweeping tax cuts, strict government economy, and limited aid to farmers. He stubbornly refused to use federal economic power to check the growing boom. And when agriculture and certain industries became depressed, he still stayed hands-off. In the following years, he twice vetoed farm relief bills and literally killed a plan to produce cheap federal electric power on the Tennessee River. His entire strategy was essentially active restraint. And the genius of this is captured perfectly right here by the brilliant political commentator Walter Lippmann in 1926. Lippmann pointed out that the political genius of President Coolidge was his talent for effectively doing nothing. He literally called it active inactivity. So why did it work? Because, as Lippmann noted, it perfectly suited the mood of the country. It suited the business interests who just wanted to be let alone to make money. And it perfectly suited everyday citizens who had become totally convinced that the government was getting dangerously complicated and top-heavy. Coolidge gave them exactly what they wanted: less government. Let's move on to Section 3. The Silent Cal persona, a walking contradiction. There's an incredible contrast here. On the one hand, you have the legend of Silent Cal, a guy famous for his extreme frugality with words and a very dry, biting Yankee wit. But the reality? He was highly accessible. In fact, he was one of the most accessible presidents up to that date in history. He completely understood the growing power of the media. He allowed himself to be photographed frequently, and he was constantly openly greeting delegations at the White House. He was remarkably visible from a man whose brand was basically built on being invisible. And his dry wit? Absolute legend. His wife, Grace Goodhue Coolidge, loved to recount this one story. At a dinner party, a young woman sitting next to the president leaned in and confided that she'd made a bet. She bet she could get at least 3 words of conversation out of him during the dinner. Coolidge didn't even look at her. He just quietly retorted, "You lose." 2 words. Just a perfect illustration of how he cultivated his own myth.
But there was actually a really calculated strategy behind that silence, as he once explained to the financier Bernard Baruch. He said, "Many times I say only yes or no to people. Even that is too much. It winds them up for 20 minutes more." He understood that in politics, speaking too much invites arguments, it prolongs meetings, and it traps you in commitments. So his silence wasn't a lack of thought. It was a highly calculated political tool to just maintain control of the room. And he maintained this incredibly laconic style right up to the very end of his administration. In 1928, while he was vacationing in the Black Hills of South Dakota, everyone was wondering if he would seek another term. His response? He issued this famously brief, single-sentence statement to the press. "I do not choose to run for president in 1928. No grand speeches, no long explanations, just 10 words, and he walked away from the most powerful job on earth." Section 4, Tragedy in the White House, the Fragility of Power. Now, we really can't talk about the Coolidge presidency without addressing a profoundly heartbreaking chapter. Amidst all his immense popularity, the Coolidge prosperity, and that clever media persona, his time in the White House was shattered by a very sudden, unforeseeable tragedy. The tragedy unfolded with terrifying speed. In July 1924, his son, Calvin Jr., is just playing a normal game of tennis with his older brother on the White House grounds. During the match, Calvin Jr. sustains a small, seemingly harmless blister on his toe. But remember, this is an era before advanced antibiotics, and an infection soon appears. He develops a severe fever. He's rushed to Walter Reed Hospital, and on July 7, 1924, the president's son dies of blood poisoning. It is just terrifying to see how a mundane blister from a casual tennis match escalated so rapidly into a fatal infection. President Coolidge was absolutely devastated. He mourned silently throughout the remainder of his time in office. And honestly, this drastically changes how we view him. It grounds that emotionless, silent Cal persona in a very profound humanity. Behind the quiet, stoic public face was a grieving father, silently carrying an unimaginable burden while trying to run the country. Section 5, Out of Step with Time, the End of an Era. As we look at the legacy of a man whose timing was almost as remarkable as his silence, we see a pretty dramatic shift. Coolidge retired in 1929, completely on his own terms. But shortly after he stepped away, the disaster of the Great Depression hit the country with full force. He was forced to watch from retirement as the very Coolidge prosperity he championed just completely evaporated. It leaves us with this fascinating question. What happens when the era you were perfectly built for suddenly leaves you behind? How does a leader reconcile their identity when the world abruptly, violently changes gears? Right before his death in January 1933, Coolidge confided this haunting final admission to an old friend. He said, "I feel I no longer fit in with these times." It's a striking moment of self-awareness. He was the perfect man for a specific moment, a moment that demanded stability, quiet, and restraint. But when the era demanded massive government action, he knew his time had passed. It really leaves us to ponder the fleeting, ephemeral nature of political eras. Is greatness about changing the times, or just perfectly reflecting them for a brief, shining moment? Definitely something to think about.